Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about the great arrangers. Now, arranger isn't a term that some of us in the non-musical world might hear the way that we would hear songwriter or something we all know like singer. But the arranger, at least in some, I would say a lot of genres of music, is one of the most important creative forces in the link between the germination of a song or another kind of composition and you, the listener, enjoying it. So, in order to understand what an arranger is, let's try to define some of these other terms that we're familiar with. So, what's a songwriter? A songwriter is someone who composes the basic melody, harmony, aka changes of a song. So, if I sit down at a piano or a guitar and play out the notes to Somewhere Over the Rainbow, that's a melody line. And if I think of that and either write it down or play it on the piano or guitar, play it into a tape recorder, that it's memorialized. It is saved, if you will. And that is the song. Obviously, some songwriters also write their own lyrics. Sometimes they write with a lyricist. So, just to use the example, if I were to come up with the melody line, bum, 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 ba, 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 and then I were to say, hey, you Joe over there, think of some words that go along with it. Somewhere over the rainbow. Ah, perfect. And that's a song. That is a song being written. And obviously, musicians who play it and singers who sing it are the performers. But the arranger is someone who comes in between those two things. So what does that mean? So an arranger is someone who says, okay, let's have this melody line played by a violin section, and let's have these chords played by the cellos. Let's have a guitar part vamping in the background. Let's have a trumpet solo here. Actually, let's have a keyboard solo here. All of these different things. Which instruments play what? In other words, the arranger is the kind of interpreter or orchestrator of the initial song and literally arranges the song in the hands of musicians who play them on the instruments of the arranger's choosing. This is why the arranger is sometimes referred to as an orchestrator, but in sort of pop music, this person is usually referred to as the arranger rather than the orchestrator. Now, the great age of the professional arranger was probably from around the 1930s to the end of the 1960s, with, in my view, the 50s and 60s having some of the most memorable arrangers ever, including this man pictured behind me, Don Costa, one of the best arrangers ever. He worked with so many of the great artists of all time. He worked with Johnny Mathis, he worked with The Temptations. He worked with so many, but he's probably most famous for working with Frank Sinatra. He did some of Sinatra's best albums, including my favorite Sinatra album, Sinatra and Strings. So what he did on that album is he took songs, most of which were written long before the 1962 date, during which the album was recorded, and he arranged them. Obviously, it was Sinatra for strings, so that album featured a very large string section. Costa arranged it. And the arrangers on what we now refer to as classic pop albums, your Nat King Cole's, your Frank Sinatra's, your Dean Martin's, he also worked with Dean Martin, Don Costa. The arranger was really the person, more than anyone else, who crafted the sound of the album. The arranger was really in the driver's seat because these classic pop albums, they were typically recording songs from what was called the Great American Songbook. So they were songs certainly by the 1950s and 60s that most people had already heard, but it was the arranger who transformed them into something new so that you were hearing them in a new light, in a new style. And there were so many great ones. There was Oliver Nelson, who himself was a highly accomplished jazz composer, aka writer, and musician, but he worked with so many great musicians as an arranger. Everyone from the great organist Jimmy Smith to the wonderful Diana Ross to the vocal duo I've talked about before, Jackie and Roy, to Louis Armstrong, to Paul Horn. The list goes on. Nancy Wilson. So many. And there was, of course, one of the great arrangers, probably most associated with CTI Records, particularly in the 70s, and this was Don Sebesky. So many interesting people he worked with: George Benson, Kenny Burrell, Paul Desmond. These were all people on CTI in the day. Maynard Ferguson, Ernesto Gilberto, one of the great singers of bossa nova. Freddie Hubbard's First Light and Skydive, two really, really good albums. He did the arrangements to my favorite Jackie and Roy album that I talked about, Time and Love, a really interesting psychedelic jazz vocal pop fusion album from 1972. He did Bumpin', my favorite Wes Montgomery album with such great strings. And then you have people like Gordon Jenkins, another of my favorites, who did another great, so many great Sinatra albums, but he did September of My Years, another favorite. All Alone, a frankly underrated Frank Sinatra album. He did some of the best arrangements of Nat King Cole's albums, Gordon Jenkins. And there are so many great arrangers. Joe Beck's album Beck was also done by Don Sebesky. He was really busy in the 70s. Great guitar album that. No relation to Jeff Beck, though. So let's not get that confused. But so you see, arrangers could do anything. They could do jazz, they could do classic pop, they could do rock. Jimmy Webb, one of my favorite songwriters, talked a lot in his interview with Rick Beato about his privilege in working with great arrangers on those wonderful songs that he wrote. So, um, there's also a bit of a mystique about arrangers that I think that we need to not necessarily break. I think we lost the connection there for a moment, but I do think we're back. But there is a mystique about arrangers because while being a professional arranger was someone who was very important to the crafting of music, we're all arrangers when we play. So, for instance, bands like the Rolling Stones, certainly in their early days, didn't have a professional arranger. But when they, as a collective unit, as a band, decided, right, let's have Brian Jones play this and Keith play this, that was arrangement. In prog rock, everyone is an arranger. Let's see, okay, I want this in the Mellotron, then I want that on the Fender Rhodes. Then I want a slide guitar there. Then I want a 12 string there. That is the act of arranging. So every performer who doesn't otherwise hire a professional arranger ends up doing the arrangements themselves. Whether the arrangements are rather simplistic, I'm going to play this on the guitar while you go like this on a cowbell. So they can range from the sophisticated to the simplistic. But the point is, the arranger, in one form or another, is that person who transforms that original composition into the song. Now, some might be asking, well, how does this work in classical music? Well, in classical music, these two people are usually the same. Beethoven will write out the composition, but he will also score it for the orchestra. So it will be the composer saying, right, the violins do this, the cello do this, the trumpets do this. But like I said, in pop music, it's typically, but not always, different people. So now we all know what arrangers are and why they've been so important across several very important genres of music. Let me know in the comments section who your favorite arranger is or arrangers are. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.